In March 2008, on a windy Tuesday outside Hastings in Adams County, Cody Thornton pulled his 1997 Ford F-250 into the cooperative lot with 312,000 miles on the odometer, rust through both rear fenders, and a feed sack stretched over a torn bench seat. He stepped out in faded overalls with a stitched knee patch that did not match the fabric, mud on his boots from morning checks, and a cap so sun-bleached the original logo was almost gone. Half the men near the fertilizer counter gave him the same quick look they gave any farmer they thought was running out of room, out of credit, or out of luck. That was the misread. It happened because he looked like strain and scarcity when he was, in truth, running one of the most liquid, debt-free operations in the county. Rex Hollis noticed him before anyone else did. Rex was the land agent for Prairie Meridian Minerals, and he dressed for rooms with polished floors, not machine sheds with oil pans on the concrete. Pressed shirt, clean belt buckle, bright dealership-style boots, late model pickup with no dust in the wheel wells. He carried a leather folder and a way of speaking that suggested urgency was wisdom. In public, within easy earshot, he said what he had said for months. Men who refuse modern money stay poor on purpose. Cody heard it. He did not answer. He signed for seed treatment, loaded 2 pallets, and left. By appearance alone, the verdict looked reasonable. Cody farmed 940 acres of corn and soybeans, lived in the original 2-bedroom farmhouse his grandfather had wired by hand, and had never remodeled the kitchen beyond replacing a failed refrigerator in 2003 for $589. His annual household spending in 2007 was $28,460, with line items written in a ledger he kept in pencil. Groceries, $7,980, utilities, $3,740, fuel for personal driving, $2,180, medical and insurance out of pocket, $4,210, property tax and home upkeep, allocation, $6,950, clothing and boots, $620, church and local giving, $2,780, no vacation line, no restaurant line beyond $156 for 6 diner breakfasts during planning delays. What nobody saw while they talked about his truck was his treasury ladder and the discipline behind it. By age 42, Cody had cash and cash equivalents, totaling $1,184,000, divided across staggered certificates and short-duration government paper, so that money matured monthly and quarterly. He had no operating note, no machinery lien, no personal credit balance carried past billing date. Since 1996, every implement purchase had been used and paid in full. That method did not come from theory. It came from memory and arithmetic. Cody was 11 when he watched a family 2 miles east lose 480 acres at auction in 1977 after variable debt moved from 7.2% to double digits across renewals. His father did not deliver a speech that day. He drove home, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote 2 numbers on scrap cardboard. Borrowed $302,000 and paid back $511,000. Then he set the cardboard beside a coffee cup and left it there for a week. Cody stared at it every morning before school. Principal plus interest was not abstract after that. In 1985, as the farm crisis tightened, another lesson arrived closer. His uncle had financed machinery upgrades aggressively in the late 1970s, believing yield growth would outrun debt service. By 1984, he had equipment notes of $418,000 and land debt of $690,000. With blended rates above 13%, after resets. Corn dropped below his break-even. He sold a combine, then leased one back, then sold 120 acres to meet covenants, then still lost control. Good man, hard worker. One wrong framework in the wrong cycle. Cody never mocked him. He attended that auction too and carried fence posts afterward so the place did not look abandoned. After high school, Cody did not inherit a large block of clear land. He started with 160 acres under a family arrangement that required annual payment to two siblings and his mother, all documented and fair. In 1988, he earned $12,400 off-farm, doing welding and winter repair work, and every dollar after taxes went to reducing that family obligation early. In 1989, he rented an additional 120 acres at $68 per acre, planted conservative populations, and accepted smaller yields to protect input cost. He bought his first planter at auction in 1990 for $2,750 cash and spent $410 on bearings and chain over 2 winters. The neighbor who bought a newer unit financed $19,600 at 10.1%. Both planted on time. One of them mailed a payment every month. By 1993, Cody made the only financing mistake he ever admitted without being asked. He took a short operating line of $42,000 at 8.9% because a late spring pushed input purchases into a narrow window and he wanted speed. The crop year itself was acceptable, but he counted all carrying cost, fees, and timing penalties when grain moved later than expected. Total cost of that convenience was $4,386. He called it tuition and paid it once. From 1996 forward, the policy hardened into routine. Used equipment only, cash only, repair first, replace late. Keep liquidity visible in writing, not in memory. In that first no-debt year, he bought a 20-year-old grain drill for $1,100, put $620 into opener discs, and ran it 8 seasons. In 1998, he purchased a used John Deere 4440 at county sale for $13,800, then logged maintenance by hour in a spiral notebook. Fluids at 150-hour intervals, hydraulic checks every spring, injector service, pre-harvest. In 2001, he added a used combine with high hours for $46,000, spent $8,900 over 3 years on preventative work, and avoided a financed replacement package priced at $214,000 plus tax and interest. By then, what looked from the road like frugality bordering on hardship had become a deliberate buffer, built year after year against the kind of offer that promises relief up front and dependence later. Long before any mineral packet reached his mailbox, the arithmetic was already in place. The numbers continued to stack in plain sight for anyone willing to inspect them. 1999 net operating margin after family obligations and taxes, $84,200. 2000, $96,700. 2001, weaker prices, margin fell to $71,500, still positive. 2002, $88,300. 2003 drought pressure, trimmed gross revenue, but no note meant no lender meeting, and margin held at $64,900. 2004, $103,400. 2005, $119,800. 2006, $132,600. 2007, $147,200. Over that 9-year stretch, he carried average household spending below $30,000 and reinvested surplus into short-term instruments with staggered maturity. The county called him tight. The balance sheet called him prepared. His discipline was visible in small places most people ignored. He kept bolts sorted in labeled coffee cans, reused hydraulic fittings when thread integrity passed inspection, and bought pallet quantities of filters during winter discounts. He ran tire pressure checks every Monday in season because underinflation costs fuel and sidewall life. He tracked per acre fuel burn by field and adjusted tillage passes where compaction allowed. These were not dramatic savings 1 year at a time, but they compounded. In 2007 alone, reducing one fall pass on 310 soybean acres saved 496 gallons of diesel and roughly $1,364 at his contracted fuel price. His house reflected the same paradigm. The roof was replaced in 2005 for $6,300, paid the week the invoice arrived. The water heater failed in 2006, replaced for $540. He wore mended shirts until fabric could not hold another seam. He was not performing poverty. He simply did not spend to signal comfort to men who judged wealth by monthly payments. People around him were not fools, and they were not reckless caricatures. They were farmers managing real pressure in a period when scales seemed to reward speed. New combines improved capacity. Larger planters captured weather windows. Land rents climbed, and hesitation looked costly. Conventional advice said to leverage while rates were favorable and let future production carry the paper. On paper, that argument was coherent. But Cody asked one recurring question: what survives a bad sequence? 2 weak price years and 1 equipment failure can erase optimism if fixed obligations are rigid. Cash does not eliminate risk, yet it changes the shape of risk. Debt turns uncertainty into schedule. By early June 2008, when Prairie Meridian's lease packets began moving through coffee counters and mailbox stacks, Cody already knew how he would evaluate them. Not by the size of the signing bonus first, by control terms, downside exposure, and what options remained if projected production failed to materialize. Rex Hollis, confident and smiling, started telling landowners the offer would never come again. Cody carried his packet home, set it beside his ledger at the same kitchen table, where cardboard math had once taught him what interest can do to a family, and began reading line by line while evening light moved across the worn wood grain. He started with paragraph 9, line 14, where Prairie Meridian reserved the right to deduct post-production costs for gathering, compression, dehydration, transportation, and processing before calculating the royalty base. The offer sheet, on top, promised 18.75%. The addendum below it narrowed that promise until it looked like a different agreement. On a yellow legal pad, Cody wrote a simple test. Projected gross value per month, $41,200, royalty at 18.75% equals $7,725. Less a 42% deduction estimate leaves $4,480. Then he wrote another line beneath it. Debt payment does not shrink when checks do. By 10 that night, he had circled 2 more clauses in red pencil. One allowed broad pooling authority across adjoining tracts, meaning his acres could be combined with the lower performing zones and averaged into weaker economics. The other granted a 2-year extension option at company discretion for terms far below original bonus rates if development lagged. He read both clauses 3 times, then compared them against county filing language from older leases he kept in a banker box labeled rights. His conclusion was not dramatic. The structure transferred timing control away from the landowner while preserving company optionality. He folded the packet, set it flat, and wrote one word on the cover: no. The next afternoon, Rex Hollis came down the lane in a polished black half-ton with chrome so clean it reflected the windbreak trees. Rex stood near the feed sack on Cody's truck seat, glanced at the rusted wheel arch, and delivered his pitch in the tone of a man correcting a stubborn student. On 640 mineral acres, he said, Cody was looking at $1,120,000 within 30 days. He called it free money. He called hesitation outdated thinking. Cody stayed by the porch rail, one hand on the packet, and answered in 8 words. I read the deductions and extension language. No. Rex laughed in the driveway. Not cruel, but sharp enough for the hired man at the machine shed to hear it. You just turned down a retirement you do not deserve. Then he left a business card anyway, tucked into the screen door frame like a final warning. Within a week, 5 neighbors signed. Dale Morrow committed 520 acres and took a $910,000 bonus. Anita Klein signed 423 acres for $740,250. Evan and Luke Perez jointly signed 788 acres and split $1,379,000 before legal fees. Harold Stinn leased 310 acres for $542,500. Every one of them had understandable reasons. Dale wanted to reset after 2 heavy repair years and secure more field capacity before his knees got worse. Anita needed irrigation reliability after a dry cycle. The Perez brothers were trying to keep a 3rd generation on land without splitting it into uneconomic pieces. Harold wanted to prepay inputs and stop arguing with lenders each spring. The town read those checks as proof, at seed pickup at church parking lots, and by the livestock barns at the county fair. The question followed Cody like dust. Why reject 7 figures when everyone else was finally moving forward? He wore the same patched overalls, drove the same 1997 Ford, and kept saying versions of one sentence. Bonus money is one time, payment books are every month. Men shook their heads, a few women nodded quietly and said nothing out loud. By the second week of July 2008, Dale had used his lease bonus as down payment leverage on a $2,400,000 machinery package at 6.9% over 7 years. His annual debt service on that package landed near $430,000 when insurance riders and maintenance plans were included. The equipment was efficient, large, and absolutely capable of covering his acres fast. It was also fixed cost tied to optimistic royalty assumptions. Anita paid off $290,000 of older notes, then financed $1,100,000 for a new pivot, grain handling upgrades, and site work at variable 5.4% to start. Her banker projected the variable line rising only modestly. She believed him because at that moment the prevailing consensus did. Evan and Luke each took $689,500 after taxes and closing costs, bought pickups, upgraded 1 combine, and signed a 1,200-acre lease expansion that pushed annual rent exposure to $318,000. Harold prepaid fertilizer and seed, then financed bins and handling equipment, expecting royalty checks to smooth the first 3 years. None of them were reckless. They were making decisions inside a framework that had looked rational during presentation slides and coffee shop forecasts. Cody's version of progress looked boring from the road. He bought a rebuilt planter for $18,600 cash, replaced 2 worn gauge wheel assemblies for $940, and kept his old tractor fleet on a preventative schedule that cost $22,700 that year, all paid from operating cash flow. He held a larger liquidity buffer than any neighbor realized, not as a trophy, but as a risk control instrument. His reserve ladder at year-end 2008 stood at $1,184,000, even after equipment and tax obligations. In 2009, it rose to $1,266,000. In 2010, with steady yields and disciplined input timing, it reached $1,341,000. In 2011, it reached $1,428,000. In 2012, it touched $1,503,000. That sequence mattered because his farm economics did not depend on a drilling calendar. In 2009, he averaged 178 bushels of corn per acre on 520 corn acres, and 51 bushels of soybeans on 420 soybean acres, with blended realized prices that left a net operating margin of $161,400 after all direct costs and family living. In 2010, slightly stronger corn and controlled fertilizer purchasing lifted margin to $174,900. In 2011, weather volatility cut performance, yet margins still came in at $152,600 because there was no operating interest line bleeding cash each month. The arithmetic was plain. Smaller upside in boom years, much wider survival margin in uncertain years. Before we go any further, if you want to know exactly how one quiet no became countywide leverage later, hit subscribe now, because the next phase is where the contracts stop looking theoretical and start touching real families. The first test wells reported weaker than projected. Initial production curves flattened early. Natural gas prices softened. Then the deductions Cody had circled in red appeared on royalty statements in black ink. Across the first 18 months, effective reductions on gross proceeds ranged from 38% to 52%, depending on route and processing loads. Dale had expected around $26,000 a month from royalty flow at his peak forecast. By late 2013, he was averaging $6,900 while carrying $18,400 in monthly machinery and related obligations. He did not lose his character. He lost financial room. Anita's variable rate reset higher into a credit tightening cycle, and her combined payments and operating obligations pushed her negative by roughly $11,200 per month during the worst stretch. She made every call herself, renegotiated every line she could, and sold stored grain in tranches to avoid panic pricing. Evan and Luke missed 2 note payments after a weak quarter and had to surrender part of their lease expansion. Harold sold 80 acres to prevent foreclosure and kept farming what remained, quieter than before, but still showing up before sunrise. In March 2014, county records hearings exposed what had been buried in legal language few people had fully parsed. Several leases, including those signed by Cody's neighbors, contained depth control structure that let Prairie Meridian hold shallow rights while deferring deeper formations without meaningful production commitments. Families had accepted immediate bonus cash, and in return had constrained their ability to renegotiate more valuable horizons later. That was the underlying trade-off, and it was non-trivial. Rex returned that month with what he called a final courtesy. Prairie Meridian would buy Cody's minerals outright for $900 per acre. On his 640 acres, that was $576,000 cash. Quick close, no future uncertainty. He brought clean paperwork, highlighted signature tabs, and the same polished certainty. Cody listened, asked 2 questions about title burdens and depth release language, and declined again. He did not decline out of pride. He declined because he had run a long horizon valuation that treated optionality as an asset, not an emotional preference. Immediate sale value looked large in a single year. Retained control over future negotiations, paired with debt-free farm cash flow and liquid reserves, modeled higher over a 20-year window even under conservative commodity assumptions. So he shifted $1 million from mixed short instruments into short-term government bonds yielding between 2.1 and 2.8%, accepted modest return, and preserved maneuverability. Before winter set in, he stood with Harold near a fence line after a windy afternoon of stalk shredding, and he gave him the line that would travel farther than either man expected. If you keep the dirt, you keep choices. Harold stood with both hands on the top wire and watched the shredded stalks lift and settle in the wind. He did not answer right away. Then he gave a short nod and said, "I should have read slower." Cody did not argue with that. He just looked across the section line where 3 new grain bins stood on Harold's place like silver promises that had arrived 1 year too early. The bins were useful assets. The financing behind them was the problem. 2 nights later, after chores and before the first hard freeze, Cody sat at his kitchen table with ledgers from 3 decades spread in small stacks by year. He was not sentimental about paper. He used it as instrument calibration. If his thesis was right, the pattern should hold under pressure, not just in clean years. He penciled a sequence on fresh pages, then copied it into a single timeline he could review in 10 minutes. 1988. Off-farm welding income, $12,400. Family land obligation paid down $9,200. Cash carried into winter, $2,140. 1989. Rented 120 acres at $68 per acre. Net after inputs and family obligations, $17,860. No operating note. 1990. Bought first planter at auction, $2,750 cash. Repairs, $410. Year-end liquidity, $26,300. 1993. Took 1 operating line, $42,000 at 8.9%. Total carrying and fee cost $4,386. Policy changed permanently. 1996. First full no-debt year. Used drill purchase, $1,100. Repair cost, $620. Margin, $58,400. 1998. John Deere 4440, $13,800 cash. Year-end liquidity, $148,900. 2001. Used combine, $46,000 cash. Declined finance package at $214,000 plus interest. Margin, despite weak market, $71,500. 2004, margin $100, $3,400. Liquidity crossed $500,000. 2007, margin $100, $47,200. Treasury ladder $1,184,000 by spring 2008. 2010, liquidity $1,341,000. No operating interest expense. 2012. Liquidity, $1,503,000. No machinery liens. No personal debt. 2014. Shifted $1 million to short-term government bonds at 2.1 to 2.8%, preserving principal and flexibility. He underlined one line at the bottom. Total interest paid to lenders over 26 years, excluding ordinary trade terms paid within billing cycle, effectively 0. That arithmetic was the center of his framework. It was never anti-growth, it was anti-fragility. He still expanded acres when rent made sense. He still bought equipment. He still improved drainage and fertility. But every expansion had to survive a downside scenario without forced sales. He treated a lender payment schedule as fixed weather. If you cannot move it, design around it. By January 2015, he updated the progression with field-level economics for the previous crop year. On 530 corn acres, average yield landed at 171 bushels per acre, with realized sale price of $3.94, producing gross corn revenue around $356,000 before basis and storage adjustments. On 410 soybean acres, yield averaged 49 bushels at $10.12 realized, adding about $203,000. Total crop revenue with program and minor custom income came in near $588,000. Direct input cost, fuel, repairs, crop insurance, labor, taxes, and overhead totaled $392,700. Operating surplus after household spending was $161,000. Because there was no debt service, that surplus went straight to reserves and planned capital. He allocated it in 4 buckets. First, $48,000 into deferred maintenance and parts inventory, because breakdown prevention is cheaper than emergency repair. Second, $36,000 into tile and water management improvements on 2 low spots that repeatedly reduced stand count. Third, $52,000 into rolling 6-month government securities. Fourth, $25,000 into a dry powder account for opportunistic land or equipment buys. Nothing dramatic, just systems. The numbers kept compounding in ways that looked small until they were not. At 2.4% average annual yield on the bond side, $1 million produced roughly $24,000 a year before tax. Not transformative by itself, but it covered a major repair year without touching farm cash flow. His annual household spending, even with modest inflation, remained below $31,000 in 2015. That meant his non-farm interest income alone could absorb most personal expenses, preserving operating margins for reinvestment. 3 days after the first March thaw in 2015, he bought a used 30-foot field cultivator at retirement auction for $9,400, paid same day, and spent $1,260 on shanks and sweeps. Comparable financed new unit offered through dealer program was $46,800 with 5-year terms at 5.7%. Monthly payment near $903 before insurance. Over 60 months, finance cost would have exceeded $54,000. Cody's all-in cash cost was $10,660. Function per acre was not identical, but for his pass count and field conditions, it was sufficient. That is the hidden math in plain equipment decisions. If you are listening to this and thinking the discipline sounds too strict to sustain, stop for one moment and ask yourself what freedom costs in your own work. The monthly payment you avoid today is often the option you keep 10 years from now. By summer, the contrast across Adams County sharpened. Dale Morrow's operation looked modern and efficient from the road, and in many ways it was. He could plant faster, harvest faster, and move grain with less labor per bushel, but the capital structure behind that speed left almost no room for weak pricing. His machinery package carried annual obligations near $430,000, and when royalty checks underperformed, the shortfall had to come from crop margins that were already compressed. In 2015, after corn softened and repairs ran higher than forecast, Dale's farm-level cash flow was negative by roughly $146,000 before family living. He covered part through inventory sales and a renewed line, then deferred equipment maintenance he would normally never defer. Anita Klein's decisions had been prudent within the assumptions available when she signed. The pivot improved water control. The grain setup reduced bottlenecks. Her records were meticulous, and she negotiated hard with suppliers. Yet variable rate debt punished timing. By late 2015, her financing stack had reset above initial projections, pushing annual interest burden up by more than $38,000 versus origination assumptions. Her royalty deposits, trimmed by deductions and lower production than projected, averaged far below planning models. She stayed current by selling old machinery she had hoped to keep as backup and by cutting family draws to the minimum her accountant considered sustainable. Evan and Luke Perez faced a different version of the same mechanism. Their 1,200-acre lease expansion made strategic sense under high-volume assumptions, but rent exposure of $318,000 per year became heavy when both royalties and commodity prices disappointed simultaneously. They were not extravagant men. Their pickup purchases became local gossip, but the larger pressure came from leased acres priced for better markets. In fall 2015, they surrendered 420 leased acres, paid penalties to exit one contract, and consolidated around their core ground to preserve equity. It was a painful, rational retreat. Harold Sten, after selling 80 acres earlier to block foreclosure, spent 2015 in constant renegotiation. His bins still saved handling costs, yet debt service consumed the benefit. He sold a newer tractor and returned to an older unit with more hours. He cut fertilizer rates on one field below his preferred levels and accepted lower yield potential because cash preservation overruled optimization. No one in this group was foolish. That is the non-trivial point. They were competent operators caught by structural asymmetry. Upside was modeled as probable, downside was treated as remote, and contracts shifted control to parties with deeper balance sheets. When downside arrived, the monthly note did not negotiate. By the first week of December 2015, external pressures stacked into a true crisis. A dry pattern had already lowered subsoil moisture in the parts of south-central Nebraska. Then commodity markets slid again. Local cash corn bids spent long stretches below many operators' full-cost break-even. Lenders tightened renewal standards. Working capital ratios that had passed comfortably 2 years earlier now triggered extra collateral requests and shorter review cycles. The policy environment did not rescue anyone. Crop insurance cushioned revenue drops, but it could not service oversized debt stacks built on royalty expectations that never fully materialized. Cody's farm still took weather risk and market risk. He was not immune. His 2015 and 2016 gross revenue projections fell with everyone else's. The difference sat in the liability column. With zero debt service, he could scale discretionary spending without breaching covenants, because there were no covenants to breach. He reduced one capital project, deferred non-essential shed work, and preserved cash. His operating plan for 2016 assumed conservative prices, modest yields, and no mineral income. Even under that scenario, he remained solvent, with positive working capital. In March 2016, Adams County saw 2 weeks of hot wind that stripped early moisture and set a nervous tone for planting season. Input suppliers shortened payment windows for heavily leveraged accounts. One regional lender required immediate principal reduction from several borrowers before renewing full operating lines. Dale sold a grain cart and one header to satisfy terms. Anita refinanced into a longer amortization to lower monthly pressure, accepting higher total interest over life of loan. Evan and Luke brought in a consultant, cut rented acres further, and moved to strict cash budgeting by month. Harold leased out part of his remaining ground to reduce working capital strain. By late June 2016, the drought signal was no longer theoretical. Corn ratings dropped, dryland yield expectations came down, and forward contract strategies that had looked conservative in April became stressful in July. At the same time, one of Prairie Meridian's key backers pulled back from additional local development after disappointing well economics. That decision mattered more than public statements suggested. It reduced near-term drilling probability and weakened already thin royalty hope across leased tracts. The cascade was mechanical. Lower expected crop income plus reduced royalty confidence plus tighter credit standards equals distressed asset flow. In early July, notices began appearing in courthouse postings and legal papers, machinery dispersal sales, contract disputes, 2 formal default actions tied to land collateral, 1 restructured agreement that failed within 60 days. By the second week of August, 3 family holdings totaling 1,120 acres were scheduled for auction in 8 parcels at the Adams County Courthouse steps. Cody did what he always did when conditions turned unstable. He ran numbers before sunrise and after supper. Parcel by parcel, he estimated productive value under conservative yield and price assumptions, then set maximum bids that preserved margin without borrowed funds. He checked maturity dates on his securities ladder, scheduled redemptions to align with auction timing, and moved proceeds into cashier check-ready accounts. The amounts were precise. Parcel 1 ceiling $610,000. Parcel 2, $785,000. Parcel 3, $402,000. Parcel 4, $1,040,000. Parcel 5, $1,132,000. Alternate reserve if bidding softened, $400 to $20,000. On the evening before the auction, his 1997 Ford sat by the machine shed with the same rusted fenders and the same feed sack across the seat. The truck still made people underestimate him. The ledger on his kitchen table did not. At 8:42 on the morning of the auction, Cody parked the same rust-edged Ford along the south curb of the Adams County Courthouse, 2 blocks from where newer trucks were lined up nose out like polished inventory. He carried a plain manila envelope, not a briefcase, and walked past a circle of lenders, attorneys, and bidders who had already sorted each other by jacket, watch, and vehicle. Rex Hollis stood near the courthouse steps with 2 out-of-county investors and a title representative, speaking in low, assured tones about consolidation strategy and lease continuity. When he saw Cody, he gave a short smile that held no warmth and no surprise, as if the day had already been priced. Inside, registration required bidder credentials, proof of funds, and immediate deposit capability. The clerk asked Cody for financial backing, expecting a local pre-approval letter at best. He handed over 5 cashier checks and 1 bank letter. The checks were from Heartland State Bank in Hastings, $1,150,000, $980,000, $760,000, $550,000, and $480,000. Total, $3,920,000. The accompanying letter confirmed additional liquid balances and maturing government paper above the check total. The clerk read the figures twice, then stamped his bidder card without another question. The title representative beside Rex asked quietly to see the letter again. He did not ask a third time. Bidding opened on Parcel 1 at 9:03. Acreage moved fast, terms were read, mineral exceptions were restated, and every pause carried the sound of forced decisions. Rex's group won 2 parcels in the first sequence, with aggressive early jumps. On parcel 3, Cody entered at $540,000 and held his ceiling discipline, while 2 bidders tested him in increments of $10,000. Hammer at $602,000. On parcel 4, he stopped at $781,000 after a longer contest that thinned the field. On parcel 5, a smaller tract with a weaker access, he closed at $396,000. Parcel 6 drew the hardest contest because of contiguity and drainage quality. Cody won at $1,031,000. Parcel 7 closed at $1,110,000 after a final raise that pushed one investor into a visible headshake. 5 parcels. Total committed, $3,920,000, exactly as he had said in pencil the night before. The room shifted after that, not theatrically, but in the way markets shift, when hidden liquidity becomes public fact. Men who had treated him as cautionary now recalculated him as counterparty. Rex stepped outside between lots, called someone, returned with a tighter jaw, and watched the rest without speaking. By 11:17, the sale clerk had confirmed funds and signatures. The narrative Rex had carried for 8 years dissolved in one courthouse morning. The man in patched canvas had cash capacity, larger than most financed groups in the room. Then Cody did the one thing no bidder expected. He asked the auctioneer for 2 minutes before adjournment and spoke in the same flat tone he used when discussing seed depth. He said he would offer contract for deed repurchase rights on the parcels, tied to defaulted family lines, limited to adult children who would farm the ground directly. Price would be his exact cost basis per parcel, plus 1.5%, simple interest over 15 years. No balloon payment, no prepayment penalty, mandatory crop insurance, real estate taxes current by December 31st each year. If a year failed because of weather, principal could slide 1 year without default if taxes and insurance were paid. No applause, no speeches, just silence, then the sound of people writing numbers. By the 3rd week of August 2016, the first meetings took place at Cody's kitchen table, one family at a time, with county forms stacked beside a coffee pot that had seen 30 harvests. Dale Morrow came with his son Caleb, age 26, who had been custom spraying and saving cash in a separate account. Their parcel under Cody's purchase ledger was 140 acres at $602,000. Contract total at 1.5% simple over 15 years. $737,450. Annual payment, $49,163. Comparable bank financing quoted to Caleb that month at 6.25%, amortized over 15 years, would have required roughly $80,300 per year. Total repayment near $1,204,500. Difference over term, about $467,050. Dale listened, elbows on knees, and cried once quietly, when Cody slid the payment table across and said, "Farm it right, pay it steady." The Perez family came next, with Sofia Perez and Mateo Perez representing their branch. Evan and Luke sat back and let them talk. 2 parcels were relevant, one at $781,000 and one at $396,000. Cody split terms to fit projected cash flow and avoid forced overreach in year 1. Contract A, $781,000 principal, simple interest total, $175,725, total due $956,725, annual payment $63,782. Contract B, $396,000 principal, Simple interest total $89,100. Total due $485,100. Annual payment $32,340. Combined annual obligation $96,122. The local commercial alternative they had been offered for equivalent principal at blended rates near 6.6% would have pushed annual debt service above $136,000 with tighter covenants. Their first-year breathing room under Cody's structure, approximately $39,900. Harold Sten arrived with his daughter, Erin, who had been managing records for a feed business in Hastings, and wanted back onto the remaining family ground. Her parcel was the 104-acre tract Cody had taken at $1,031,000, but she lacked immediate operating capital for inputs and repairs. Cody separated land recovery from operating strain. He wrote two agreements: a 15-year land contract at 1.5% simple with $1,031,000 principal, $231,975 total interest, and $84,198 annual payment, plus an 18-month zero-interest bridge of $86,000 for seed, fertilizer, and machinery catch-up, repayable in 3 installments aligned with harvest sales. "You cannot fix structure with panic," he said. "We do this in order." This is where the philosophy stops being private discipline and becomes public architecture. He did not rescue people by erasing arithmetic. He rewrote arithmetic so good operators could survive it. Let me stop here and ask you something. When pressure hits your own decisions, do you optimize for appearance this quarter or control next decade? Put your answer in the comments, then watch what the numbers did after these contracts were signed. By November 2016, all 4 recipient contracts were filed with county records, including default cure provisions, tax obligations, and right of first refusal language that prevented quick flipping. Cody also added one clause that mattered long-term. If any recipient sold outside family before year 15, 50% of capital gain above inflation-adjusted basis had to be donated to a beginning farmer fund. Not to him, to the county foundation account he had not yet announced publicly. He funded transition support with exact amounts, each document. Caleb Morrow received $42,500 in equipment grants tied to repair invoices, not new purchases. Sophia and Mateo Perez received $61,200 to replace failing irrigation electric service and rebuild a worn grain auger line, paid directly to vendors. Aaron Sten used the $86,000 bridge and repaid the first $28,667 on schedule after her 2017 crop sold. Anita Klein, still under variable rate strain, unrelated to auction parcels, called Cody in January 2017 and asked for short-term help to avoid a forced machinery liquidation. He extended a separate zero-interest emergency bridge of $120,000 for 18 months with monthly cash reporting and no fee. She repaid in 14 months after refinancing stabilized. 3 days after the first March windstorm in 2017, Cody opened his ledger and built a deeper examination that linked his no-debt framework, the auction deployment, and the recovery contracts in one continuous sequence. 2016 year-end after auction settlements and fall crop close, liquid reserves reduced to $462,000, land acquired 782 acres, at $3,920,000 basis. Personal debt still zero. 2017. Crop operating surplus $148,300. Bond and cash yield income $18,900. Contract for deed receipts collected $229,483. Bridge balances outstanding $177,333. Reserves rebuilt to $689,000 by December. 2018. Crop surplus $156,800. Contract receipts $229,483. Anita Bridge fully repaid. Aaron Bridge balance reduced to zero by October. Reserves $982,000. 2019. Crop surplus $162,400. Contract receipts $229,483. Maintenance and tile reinvestment $94,600. Reserves $1,251,000. 2020. Price volatility increased gross swings, but with zero debt service, his operating plan stayed positive. Crop surplus $171,900. Contract receipts $229,483. Reserves $1,518,000. 2021. Drought pressure. Trimmed yields. Surplus dropped to $119,500. Contract receipts unchanged. No covenant stress because there were no covenants. Reserves $1,682,000. 2022. Stronger soybean pricing lifted surplus to $214,800. Contract receipts $229,483. Reserves $2,074,000. 2023. Normalized markets. Surplus $187,600. Contract receipts $229,483. Beginning farmer fund seeded at $2,517,000 from accumulated reserves and appreciated asset restructuring. The comparison line that mattered most was not dramatic. If Cody had signed the original 2008 mineral lease on 640 acres for a $1,120,000 bonus, and then mirrored his neighbor's leverage pattern, projected debt service under even moderate expansion would have absorbed optionality by 2013. Instead, by declining immediate cash twice and preserving rights, he maintained strategic liquidity through a full commodity and credit cycle, then converted liquidity into community-stabilizing credit at terms banks were not offering. Rex Hollis received that ledger indirectly in spring 2018 when one investor from the auction group requested a post-mortem on why their consolidation model failed in Adams County. The answer was uncomfortable and precise. They had modeled landowners as sellers under stress. Cody was a buyer without debt. They had priced immediate need. He priced time. By the end of planning that year, people in Hastings still saw the same truck. At the cooperative, same feed sack on the seat, same faded cap, same habit of buying parts in cash. What changed was not his appearance. It was the county's understanding of what appearance had hidden all along. What changed next was administrative, then personal, then generational. By January 2018, the first full cycle of Cody's recovery contracts had produced what banks had said could not be produced at those terms: on-time land payments, current taxes, and improving operating ratios for families who had been marked distressed 18 months earlier. Caleb Morrow made his first 2 annual payments without extension, then paid an extra $8,000 principal in 2019 after a stronger soybean year. Dale stayed on 320 rented acres and took a part-time grain desk shift at the cooperative 3 evenings a week, not because he had quit farming, but because stable wages protected his reset plan. He told people plainly, "I chased volume before margin. By 2024, Caleb had reduced remaining contract balance on the 140 acres to $296,000, while appraised value at local comparable sales, near $9,800 per acre, put that tract around $1,372,000. Equity, roughly $1,076,000. The family line was back on ownership trajectory. Sophia and Mateo Perez ran their 2 contract parcels through a conservative crop rotation and one rule Cody insisted on during intake: no major equipment note until 2 consecutive years of cash reserve above 12 months of land and input obligations. They disliked that rule in year 1. They defended it by year 4. In 2020, they prepaid $40,000 against Contract A, then another $35,000 in 2022 when basis improved on stored grain. Evan and Luke kept smaller acreages under the family reset, each with reduced rent exposure and shared labor during harvest. Nobody in that family spoke about getting big anymore. They spoke about staying solvent in ugly years. By spring 2024, combined remaining balance across both Perez contracts had fallen below $560,000, with land value materially above that. Their accountant, who had once warned they might be liquidated, now flagged them as one of the cleaner working capital profiles in their district. Aaron Sten's sequence was the most technically difficult and emotionally steady. She used Cody's 18-month zero-interest bridge exactly as designed: seed, fertility, deferred repair, and one used grain cart bought for $14,200 cash from a retirement listing. No discretionary upgrades. She repaid the $86,000 bridge on schedule, then accelerated land payments by directing custom hauling side income into principal. Harold retired to Hastings, sold most equipment, kept 40 acres clear, and spent spring mornings helping Aaron calibrate planters and check population settings. He was debt-free by 2021. He said he slept through the night for the first time in a decade. Anita Klein's emergency bridge became a template for short-cycle recovery discipline. She took the $120,000 zero-interest line in January 2017, submitted monthly cash reports exactly as requested, refinanced her variable stack into a longer fixed structure when terms stabilized, and repaid Cody in 14 months. Then she changed her own policy framework. No variable debt without hard caps. No expansion justified by projected royalties. By 2023, she had retained her home place, rebuilt 6 months of operating reserves, and started mentoring 2 younger operators on cash flow planning through winter meetings at the cooperative. If you are learning something from this part of the story, pass it forward with a like so more people see what disciplined arithmetic looks like in real lives. The multiplier became visible by 2019 and measurable by 2024. Cody's contracts did not merely preserve 4 households. They prevented distressed land turnover that would have pushed rents higher for everyone else and reduced entry points for younger producers. Local implement repair shops kept work. Input bills were paid on calendar. School enrollment in 2 rural routes held steady instead of sliding. This was not charity as spectacle. It was credit architecture designed for durability. Then Cody formalized the next layer. In late 2023, after reserves rebuilt and asset values appreciated, he capitalized the Thornton Soil and Success Fund at $2,600,000. The charter was plain: 0% beginning farmer loans up to $140,000, mandatory enterprise budgets reviewed quarterly, and one reciprocal condition that echoed his courthouse clause. Every recipient had to mentor one applicant for at least 2 seasons before final payoff. 12 loans were issued between 2023 and 2024, totaling $1,408,000. None were gifts. Every loan had reporting discipline and crop insurance requirements. By fall 2024, those 12 borrowers collectively controlled 3,480 acres through ownership or long-term contract positions, with combined equity estimated at $18,200,000. One disciplined balance sheet had become a county-level flywheel. Rex Hollis did not disappear after the courthouse auction, but his operating terrain narrowed quickly. Through 2017, he remained at Prairie Meridian, trying to salvage relationships in Adams County and adjacent sections where lease dissatisfaction had hardened into refusal. Landowners took meetings, listened, and declined. A firm that depends on trust cannot absorb repeated skepticism forever. By mid-2018, after his investor group's consolidation model underperformed and internal reviews blamed field intelligence failures, Rex left Prairie Meridian. He landed at a regional brokerage handling mineral and surface rights transactions on a salary plus fee structure. Less visibility, smaller book. The irony was dry and complete. The man who once sold urgency began advising caution in contract language. He started recommending narrower pooling clauses and clearer deduction definitions, partly because markets demanded it, partly because he had seen what aggressive assumptions do when prices and production disappoint at the same time. He never made a public apology tour. That was not his style. But in a continuing education panel in Lincoln, in 2021, he said one sentence that reached Hastings anyway. If the landowner does not control downside, the deal is not balanced. Men who knew the backstory recognized the admission. By 2024, Rex was still working, quieter, mostly on review and structuring rather than front-end persuasion. He and Cody crossed paths twice at county offices, nodded once each time, and kept walking. No reconciliation scene, no theatrical reckoning. Just an antagonist, resolved by consequence, with his certainty replaced by a narrower, more nuanced framework. Cody's own roll call was almost stubborn in its consistency. He still drove the 1997 Ford F-250 with the same patch seat and rusted rear fenders, now well past 350,000 miles. He still wore faded overalls and bought work shirts on end-of-season clearance. He still ran paid-for equipment, including the older tractor fleet he had maintained by hour logs for decades. The John Deere 4440 remained in active duty for lighter tillage and auger work. The combine had been updated once, used, cash, after post-harvest inspection costs crossed his replace threshold. No machinery lines, no personal debt. His household ledger in 2024 showed annual living costs at $33,870, still under the threshold people around town once called unrealistic. Groceries, $9,140, utilities, $4,620, fuel and transportation, $3,040, medical and insurance out of pocket, $5,430, home tax and upkeep allocation, $8,140, clothing, $760, church and local giving, $2,740. He had room to spend more. He chose not to. His balance sheet was documented at $9,870,000 net worth across owned land positions, cash equivalents, government securities, contract receivable, and retained minerals. Crucially, that number was not built on leverage amplification. It was built on margin retention and optionality preserved through refusal at two key moments, 2008 and 2014, when immediate cash had looked easiest. Every named person in the story had a clear endpoint by then. Dale farmed and worked cooperative shifts, steady and respected. Caleb was on track to own his 140 acres, free and clear years early if markets remained average. Anita kept her home place and became an informal coach on debt structure. Evan and Luke each operated smaller acreages with lower fixed obligations and no appetite for fragile expansion. Sophia and Mateo managed the Perez contracts with reserves and rising equity. Harold lived in Hastings, debt-free, with 40 acres kept in family hands. Aaron operated the recovered tract with disciplined budgets and current taxes every year. Rex worked in a reduced but more careful role after leaving Prairie Meridian. Cody remained exactly what he had been, except now the county understood what that meant. By the second week of October 2024, one more loan recipient from the Thornton Fund made a first principal payment, and Cody recorded it in pencil without ceremony. He had no interest in being cast as savior. His method had always been less dramatic and more demanding. Read every line, price downside first, avoid obligations that erase choice, keep reserves liquid, and when strength accumulates, lend it in ways that outlast applause. If you want more stories where arithmetic beats appearances, subscribe now. In the comments, answer one specific question. What is one fixed monthly obligation in your own life that you could reduce this year to buy back long-term choices? Then share this with one person who looks ordinary on the outside, but has been building quietly for years. Late that afternoon, after recording receipts and checking moisture reports, Cody walked out to the shed as light dropped behind the windbreak. The old truck sat where it always sat, feed sack still stretched across the torn bench seat, dust on the hood, rust at both rear fenders. From the road, it still looked like a man hanging on. On paper, in land records, in paid tax receipts, in 12 new loan files, and in 4 families no longer cornered by bad terms, it looked like what it had been all along. Discipline turned into options, options turned into stability, stability shared. The next Thursday, Cody carried 2 boxes into the back room of the cooperative, set them on a folding table, and opened both lids in front of 6 young operators from the Thornton Soil and Success Fund. One box held forms and amortization schedules. The other held documents he had saved for 16 years. The Prairie Meridian lease packet with red circles around deduction language, the yellow pad where he had penciled gross royalty versus net after charges, and Rex Hollis's business card that had sat in his screen door frame after the driveway laugh. He did not use those papers as a warning speech. He passed them around and let silence do most of the teaching. Caleb Morrow read the extension clause and exhaled through his nose. Sophia Perez held the page with pooling authority, tapped the margin, and said, "This line looked small when we were in a hurry." Aaron Sten looked at the yellow pad arithmetic and nodded once. "Debt payment does not shrink when checks do." Cody answered, "Write that on your shop wall." By the first week of November 2024, the fund's quarterly review showed 11 of 12 loans current, 1 under weather extension but tax compliant and insured, exactly as policy allowed. Total principal issued remained $1,408,000. Principal repaid had reached $312,400. Cash reserves in the fund account stood at $1,326,700. The difference from opening capitalization reflected $177,700 already paid through board-approved operating costs and invoice-tied transition grants that sat outside the principal loan ledger. The 12 borrowers now controlled 3,480 acres with updated combined equity near $19,040,000 after autumn appraisals and principal reduction. One conservative lending structure had multiplied into a regional ownership base that no single downturn could erase quickly. The recovery contracts from 2016 kept proving durable under ordinary stress, not miracle years. Caleb's annual payment posted on December 3rd, plus an extra $12,000 principal from post-harvest grain sales. Remaining balance on his 140 acres dropped to $284,000. Dale sat at the same table while the receipt printed, looked at the number, and smiled without showing teeth. "I used to chase the biggest planter in the lot," he said. "Now I chase a smaller balance." He still worked cooperative shifts, still farmed, and slept better than he had in a decade. Sophia and Mateo came in 2 days later with color-coded field budgets and a written reserve policy stricter than Cody required. Their combined contracts fell below $520,000 after another voluntary prepayment. Evan and Luke, each on smaller acreages, arrived separately that afternoon, compared fertilizer plans, and agreed to share a nurse tank to reduce duplicated cost. The brothers had stopped arguing about who was expanding faster. They talked about break-even and liquidity. The family line held. On a windy Monday in mid-December, Aaron met Cody at the county office to file tax receipts and principal transfer for the Sten tract. Harold waited on a hallway bench with a thermos and his old cap in his hands. When Aaron came back with stamped copies, Harold stood slowly and said, "That is current, all of it." He had sold nearly all machinery, kept his 40 acres, and remained debt-free in Hastings. He spent Tuesdays helping Aaron with winter maintenance and Thursdays volunteering at the feed pantry. Relief had given him back routine. Anita's trajectory settled into its own steady rhythm. She hosted 2 winter budgeting nights at the cooperative, with 21 attendees across both sessions, and opened by putting her old variable rate worksheet on a projector. She did not hide her mistakes or dramatize them. She showed the exact month where reset assumptions broke. Then she showed the bridge loan ledger from Cody, the 14 repayment entries, and the fixed structure refinance that followed. Her home place remained hers. Her reserves covered 7 months of obligations by year-end. She had become the person younger operators called before signing terms. 3 days after New Year 2025, Rex Hollis drove back into Adams County in a plain fleet sedan, not the polished truck he had favored in 2008, and asked for 10 minutes at Cody's shop. He stood by the same Ford with rust through both rear fenders and looked at the feed sack still stretched across the torn seat. "I am building contract training for new agents," he said. "I want language that does not trap families on downside. I need examples." Cody handed him photocopies from the rights box, including depth release language he preferred and deduction definitions tied to transparent reporting. Rex held the pages for a long moment and said, "I sold certainty where there was risk." Cody answered, "Write cleaner terms. That will do." Rex's resolution stayed consistent after that meeting. He remained in mineral brokerage, but in review work, not pressure sales. In 2025, he published a plain language lease checklist through his firm that required clients to initial deduction and pooling sections separately. Some landowners still did not trust him. Others used the checklist anyway because it reduced ambiguity. He never regained his old swagger in Adams County, and he did not ask for it. He had adjusted from persuasion first to structure first, a quieter career built from one public misread. By late February 2025, Cody's own records closed the loop on every item he had tracked since 2008. The red-marked lease packet, yellow pad test, and business card were scanned and archived in the fund office binder labeled Contract Lessons. The original papers went into a fireproof drawer at the farmhouse. The banker box marked rights remained on the same shelf, now indexed by tract and clause type, for loan recipients to review before signing any surface or mineral agreement. Every document that once represented private caution had been converted into shared instruction. The annual roll call happened at the County Fair building on the first Saturday of March, with folding chairs, crock pots, and muddy boots by the door. Cody spoke for less than 4 minutes. He read numbers, then sat down. Dale and Caleb. Current, principal ahead, 140 acres on track. Anita, home place retained, reserves rebuilt, mentoring active. Evan and Luke, smaller operations, current obligations, positive working capital. Sophia and Mateo, contracts reduced, reserve targets met. Harold, retired, debt-free, 40 acres retained. Aaron, taxes current, principal current, operating surplus positive, 12 fund borrowers, all insured, all reporting, total acreage 3,480, combined equity above $19 million. No one clapped at each line. They wrote the numbers. Cody still farmed 940 acres with paid-for equipment and no personal debt. The John Deere 4440 still handled auger work and lighter tillage. Meter reading logged in the same spiral style he had used for decades. The used combine replacement from earlier years remained serviceable because maintenance was scheduled, not delayed. Household spending for 2024 closed at $33,870, almost exactly on forecast. Net worth calculations updated with winter appraisals, securities, contract receivables, and retained minerals moved slightly above the prior mark, while liabilities stayed at zero. After the meeting, people lingered by the coffee urn with notebooks open, trading renewal dates and clause language instead of machinery gossip. 2 first-year operators copied Anita's reserve targets onto seed envelopes, and an older landlord asked Sophia for her budget template before he signed anything new. Near dusk that same day, Cody stopped at the cooperative for parts, paid the invoice in full, and walked back to the Ford as wind carried grain dust across the lot. A teenager loading feed glanced at the rust, the patched seat, the faded cap, and looked away with the same old assumption. Cody started the engine, drove home past fields he had kept, past fields he had helped others keep, and set the parts on a bench beside ledgers that had outlasted every sales pitch. Appearance had always been the surface. Arithmetic had always been the truth.